Hello everybody and welcome back. So what I want to do to start out with before we worry about the opener, I want to do just a quick recap over what we looked at yesterday when we were addressing scarcity. So think back to that Daraprim and De Beers video that we looked at. So when it comes down to it, all goods are scarce, and so we've got to decide what we're going to do about that scarcity, right? If you look at World War II, they had to ration off food. If you look at today, we've got to ration off things in grocery stores. They've kind of lightened up a little bit, but for a couple of months, you could only take one roll or one box of toilet paper out with you. And so what we're going to look at today is starting to categorize these goods to maybe make a little bit more sense out of all of it. So what I want you to do to start out with, I want you to, on a separate sheet of paper, or I guess in this case, sorry, with our opener online, I want you to do it on the Google Doc. There should be a link on the Google Classroom for today for it. And I want you to list out an item. Try to make it a complicated item, like a house or a car or a dishwasher, a TV, something that's got a lot of components to it. All right, and then what I want you to do is list as many things that go into making that item as possible. It could be the parts, it could be the raw materials, it could be the people that build it, it could be the store that sells it. I want you just to make a list. You could just do it in bullets. Try to list like 15 to 20 things that go into making that item. And we'll use this a little bit later in the lesson. So if you need to pause me while you do that, that's fine. And then we'll just pick back up and we'll come back around to this opener in just a minute. All right, so the way that I like to start the day usually is through a pirate prep that can kind of recap over what we looked at the day before. These will take the concepts that we've learned and put them into a way you might see on the end of course test or that you might see on my final. All right, so today's, what basic economic problems do both higher income nations and lower income nations have in common? All right, and so when we use the term nation here, we're looking at countries, although it can mean a little bit more than that. All right, so the things that they have in common: A, that they have too many unskilled laborers; B, a lack of capital goods; C, too much government; or D, scarcity of resources. So if you think back to what we looked at yesterday, the one constant in our world is that all goods are scarce. So if you look at our country compared to other countries, right? Our country is really wealthy. Let's say that we're looking at Ethiopia, a really poor country in Africa. All right, we both deal with scarcity. Sure, we've got a lot more than they do, but there's still things that we lack. If you look at, even though we're one of the wealthiest countries in the world, we still have 10% of our country that's unemployed right now. We still have a lot of people that don't have adequate housing or enough food to feed their families. And so even though we've got a lot of wealth in our country, we still deal with this scarcity. We just kind of deal with it in different ways. So the correct answer would be D here, scarcity of resources. All countries, all people, all businesses deal with that. All right, so what we're going to look at today, we're going to call productive resources, or they're also called factors of production. So if you think about it in a math context, a factor is something that makes up something else. So if you think about 10, factors of 10 might be 2 and 5 or 1 and 10. They're the building blocks of what make up that number. So when we look at productive resources, we're looking at what goes into making the product. And this is where we'll kind of loop back around to your opener in just a little bit. But one big thing you could tell about a country is who owns these productive resources. So a crazy statistic is that over 50% of our country's wealth right now is owned by 1% of its population. That means that you have the everyday people like us, and then you've got the mega wealthy people like Jeff Bezos that owns Amazon or Mark Zuckerberg that owns Facebook. So they've got about 50% of our country's wealth right now. However, if you look at other countries, they do things a little bit differently. Like if you look at China as an example, it's not about individuals and businesses controlling these resources. It's about the government controlling these resources. And sometimes that can be really bad, sometimes that can be really good. If you look at the outbreak of this pandemic, China immediately shut down certain parts of their country, right? Sure, people lost their rights and all of that, which is of course a bad thing, but they were able to kind of put a stifling on this pandemic a little bit better than we did. On the other hand, you've got a lot more freedom in our country than you would in that country. You can choose what you want to be, what kind of business you want to open up. And so over the next couple days, we'll compare different countries, specifically looking at who owns these resources in different countries. So we'd like to break up these factors of production, or these productive resources, into 4 different categories. All right, so first off, we use this acronym CELL to help remember it. All right, a capital good is any tool that we use to make something else. So if we think back to those openers, like let's say that my opener was a house. A capital good would be anything used to produce that house. So that could be hammers or nails or shingles or the glass panes that go into the window. All of those are capital goods. They're things we're using to make something else. The E that we're going to look at is entrepreneurship. And so a lot of people get entrepreneurship and labor mixed up. All right, so labor is people doing those individual tasks. Think back to the house example, right? That's the plumber, that's the electrician, that's the welder, that's the carpenter, right? They're doing their job, they're getting a paycheck, but they're not really taking many financial risks, right? The entrepreneurship part of it, that would be the company that's building the house, like Harry Driggers Realty. If you look out by Needwood, all of those neighborhoods there were built by one company, Harry Driggers Realty. And so they took a big financial risk, right? They were hoping that people wanted to move out to this big swamp on the north end of Brunswick. And, you know, they did well for themselves, right? Now the owners of it have made a lot of money. But for as many people that made a lot of money building these houses, a lot of people also lost money, right? So back in 2008, the housing market crashed. And so a lot of people that built all of these big houses, they were just sitting with them, right? They owned 8 or 9 different houses and they didn't have a way to pay for them. So they ended up going bankrupt. So entrepreneurship is that risk-taking, right? If you think of the owners of these businesses, they would be the entrepreneurs. All right, and finally, we have land resources. Land resources are any kind of natural resource that goes into the production of a good. So if we go back to the house example, that could be the wood that goes into the supports. That could be the concrete that they lay out for the driveway. That could be any sort of raw material, the metal that goes into the screws, any sort of raw material that you would use to make something else. So a land resource is anything you could find out in nature, anything that is naturally occurring. So that could be water, that could be air, that could be wood, that could be oil. All of these exist without humans. All right, I don't believe this is in your notes, but I want to talk about it either way. We break up capital into 3 different categories. All right, so physical capital is anything you can hold in your hand and you use. So think back to the house example, right? The hammer, the nail, the screwdriver, all of those would be physical capital, something you can hold. Human capital would be any kind of skill or ability that you have. So let's switch our example over to a classroom, right? Physical capital could be the projector that we're using, the webcam I'm using to film right now. Can I teach without these things? Absolutely. But they make my job a lot easier. Human capital are the skills that I gained in college, the skills I gained over years of teaching, whether it's classroom management, whether it's how I build relationships with kids, or whether it's the way I explain things. All of those are different forms of human capital. Financial capital is just money, right? It's hard to start a business without money. It's hard to start a business without a loan. But this money is used as a tool. So you see this with a lot of businesses, right? A good example, think about what is currently I think it's the Dairy Queen over there by the new the neighborhood Walmart. Since I've been in Brunswick, it's been like 6 different restaurants. It was a Baskin Robbins, it was a Dairy Queen, it was a Five Guys for a little bit, a place called Bite My Burger. Each time that they started failing, someone else bought them out to keep the business afloat just a little bit longer. So that would be financial capital. All right, and again, this shouldn't be in your notes, but I want to look at it just a little bit more. So if we're looking at these 4 people up here, I want to look at them from a perspective of entrepreneurs. So if we look at the first person, this would of course be Simon Cowell, who is known for American Idol. Now, his role as a talk show host on American Idol doesn't really make him an entrepreneur. That's a job, right? He's a laborer there. What does make him an entrepreneur is the fact that he owns about 40% of American Idol. So if that show fails, not only is he out of a job, but he's also out of his investment. All right, if we look at the second person, we've got Oprah Winfrey up here. Again, she was originally known for her talk show. But again, she worked for a network there. That wasn't really her taking risks. That was just her doing a job. But since she got her wealth from that talk show, she bought out Weight Watchers, she owns her own O Network now, she owns her own set of magazines, all right, and so she's taken all of that money and she's taken a big financial risk with it. And so that would make her an entrepreneur. The third person we have here would be Steve Jobs. All right, and we'll watch a video a little bit later on in the semester about him and Bill Gates developing the first personal computer. So he put his whole life savings on the first Apple computer. Usually with Apple, we think of phones, but before that, they were makers of computers. So most computers these days use one of two software. They either use Windows or they use Apple. All right, and so Steve Jobs, with Bill Gates actually, they developed the first PC in Steve Jobs' parents' garage. They put everything they had into this computer, and for every Bill Gates and every Steve Jobs of the world, there was 20 other computer companies that ended up failing. All right, and then finally we have Jay-Z. All right, Jay-Z was originally known for his music. He was a rapper. All right, but same kind of thing as Oprah, right? That was more of a job. That was him being a laborer. He worked for a record label. Well, eventually he got fed up with it and said, I can do this better. So he took all of that money he made from music. He opened up Rockefeller Industries, which signed a lot of other big artists. He has Rockaware, which is his own clothing line. And he owns dozens of different companies. All right, so he could have just played it safe. He could have kept that money he made as an artist and just lived the rest of his life wealthy, but that's not what he wanted to do. He wanted to take that risk and make even more, and he did. He succeeded. All right, so what I want you to do now, after looking at these four categories, the capital, the entrepreneurship, the land, the labor, I want you to take that opener that you did, and I want you to try to categorize all of them. All right, so let's do a couple together. So let's say that we looked at that house example. All right, so let's say that we put a couple different things down. Like let's say we're looking at the wood used to build the house. We're looking at the hammer that's used to build the house. Let's say we're looking at the plumber, right? They're putting together the pipes. Let's say that we're looking at the real estate company, the one that paid for the building of the house. All right, we'll add in the concrete, or let's say the rubber that they use to make the shingles. All right, let's say that we're using a saw in order to cut down the wood. So let's go ahead and categorize a couple of these. Sorry for the handwriting. Let's go ahead and categorize a couple of these into our four different factors of production. So first off, if we're looking at wood, right, this would be a natural resource. And so if we're looking at natural resources, the first thing we should think of would be the land, right? This is something you can go out and find out in nature, something that we don't have to produce, but we still use to make something. All right, secondly, let's look at the hammer, right? So you can't really find a hammer out in nature, not unless it's like, trash or something. All right, and so we can go ahead and rule out land if we know that it's not a natural resource. Secondly, we can rule out entrepreneurship and labor because those are both people, right? Entrepreneurship would be the owners, labor would be the workers. And so if we can rule out those two, then that leaves us with capital. And again, capital is just anything we use to produce something. All right, so plumber, we can work in the opposite direction, right? We know it's a person, so we can go ahead and rule out land and capital. It's not a natural resource. It's not a tool that you can use to make something. So between entrepreneurship and labor, it would most likely be the labor, right? Because they're not taking a financial risk. They're not putting their money on the line, but they are doing that task for money. However, the real estate company would kind of be the opposite, right? They're not themselves building this house. They're outsourcing that work to somebody else. They're buying the tools. They're buying the natural resources. They're hiring the people. All right, so they would be the entrepreneurs here. They would be the ones that are taking that financial risk. In any sort of end-of-course test question, if you see the word risk, you should usually think of entrepreneurship. They usually go hand in hand together. All right, with the rubber, again, it's a natural resource. It's used to make up something else. So if it's something we can find out in nature, that would make it a land resource. And finally, with saw, isn't a natural resource, isn't a person, and so it would most likely be capital here. So what I would like you to do, take that opener that you did, and I want you to categorize all the different things that you had in there. In just a few minutes when we switch over to our Google Meet, I'm going to want to share some of these and kind of talk about them together. So again, if you need to pause me here, that's fine. Just unpause me once you're done, and then we'll give further instructions there. All right, so the last thing that I'm going to want you to do, and once I get done explaining this, is when you'll switch off of the video, and then you'll go into the Google Meet so we can talk about it a little bit together. All right, so what I'm going to ask you to do is to, on a Microsoft, on a Google Doc, I'm going to want you to type cell across the top. If you switch it to landscape, it would be a little bit easier. So you write out cell across the top. What I want you to do then is tell me what each letter stands for. And then I want you to give me 5 examples underneath of each. So first up, you're going to pick a product. Make it a different product than your opener, right? So if you did a house, maybe make a car for your second one. Or maybe make it a cell phone or something like that. So you're going to list the product. You're going to write out cell across the top of the paper. Tell me what each letter stands for. And then I want you to give me 5 examples of what could fall under that category. So if I'm doing house, then the capital could be the saw, it could be the hammer, it could be the screwdriver, it could be the steel-toed boots, it could be the welder goggles that I need. All of those would be under that capital category. Then what I want you to do is I want you to find a picture that represents that. So for the capital one, maybe a picture of a hammer, or maybe a picture of a saw in action. All right, same thing for entrepreneurship, land, and labor. All right, so once you've got that done, if you need to rewind me to hear that again, you can. But before you start, go ahead and switch over to the Google Meet. That way we can talk about it just a little bit more and the other assignment that we're going to be doing today as well. All right, thank you and talk to you guys soon.